You're listening to Idea Collider, a show that explores the world of asymmetric learning. On this show, I will sit down with pharmaceutical experts and business leaders to discuss how to embrace uncertainty and the different learning style that follows. I'm your host, Mike Rea. Let's get into the show.
Mathai, you're someone I've known for a while. I'm delighted to have you join our, this episode of Idea Collider, partly because your perspective is vast and deep. You're someone that I've known for deep thoughts as well as broad thoughts. So, tell us a bit about yourself and where you've been and how you got to where you've been.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. And like I said a moment ago, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I feel you also have had just really innovative thoughts about the industry as a whole, about particular products in particular. I've loved our conversations. So my background started in academia. I was part of an MD PhD program at Harvard, working with George Whitesides. And it's from there in a chemistry department that I had the idea for the company called Theravance. And I wrote the business plan for that company and co-founded that company back in 1997. And I've been for a number of years, and we ended up creating 5 great medicines. So, and these are things I'm very proud of, like it's over a 14-year period, right? So it's from literally start to finish, through like from ideas on a piece of paper through discovery, development, advisory committee meetings, post-approval. Like, so that's about as end-to-end as one can get. And I'm very proud of both the team and the outcomes there. And then I moved to Merck, where I ran a lot of their research and worked very closely with Roger Perlmutter, Ken Frazier, and then moved to J&J, where I ran R&D for close to 6 years and did many things there that we can talk about, but extremely proud of the work, the portfolio, the people that were assembled. That was a largely reconstructed team over the first couple of years I was at J&J. The endeavors, like the thematic endeavors, such as in data science, AI/ML, so much to be happy with. And now I'm the chairman and CEO of Parabilis Medicines, where I'm hoping to build something of real substance that has staying power and focusing on medicines that are very different from what the rest of the industry is doing, and I think can be durably differentiated and therefore have, not only significant patient value, but business value.
Yeah. So at Theravance, I mean, clearly, were you aware of how much of an outlier you were at that point, or was it just felt like normal to you?
Well, so the chairman that I had actually recruited to help found the company was Roy Vagelos.
Mhm.
So Roy Vagelos has a big view of the world, and for him, anything less than like star level success is not par for his course. So he would set such high expectations. We had an amazing team.
Sure.
We recruited all sorts of very high talent, and we together did some great things, but we never thought for a moment that we were an outlier. We just thought we were barely hanging in there, actually, most of the time.
Yeah. Did it feel like an A team at the time, or did it feel like a
It
kind
really
of?
did. It really did. Like, we recruited individuals into there. We recruited Ted Love as our first chief medical officer, Kevin Judice, Dan Marquest, Jan Smith, all sorts of people. Actually, something I counted the other day, there are 9 CEOs that we had recruited in the first 100 or 150 people,
Yeah.
the current CEOs of companies.
Wow. Roy's footprint is huge in this industry, right?
It's amazing. It's amazing. He's still someone I check in with before any major move in my own career. It's a very close mentor.
Interesting. So let's talk about Parabilis because I want to dive into your, I'm going to say, contrarian thinking, and you focused on what most others call undruggable targets. So what would be your kind of process and in thinking around undruggable?
Yeah. So first, I think it's important to define that term because sometimes it's used very loosely as inclusive of targets that have just not been drugged yet,
Yeah.
as opposed to undruggable. So I define that term in almost a physics sense: proteins that are very smooth surfaced, that they don't have divots or cavities in which to rest small molecules. So for a small molecule drug to be constructed, it needs a cavity of certain dimensions. It's now well understood what the dimensions of that cavity, the nature of that cavity needs to be. And the truth of it is, most proteins inside your cell don't have such cavities. So most proteins inside your cell are not druggable in that sense.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm including. You can attach to large flat surfaces, but you need another large flat drug. You can't use a small molecule. So if these same proteins were outside a cell, one could use an antibody because they have a relatively large surface and take advantage of all these micro interactions to make a high affinity, high specificity interaction. But antibodies don't go inside cells. So at Parabilis, we've done, this is Greg Verdine's brainchild probably 20 years ago. And this company started, him as the founder about 10 years ago, was to use peptides that were very special peptides. We call them helicons, that have lots and lots of these non-canonical or unnatural amino acids that are made into a particular shape, an alpha helical structure, that are the kinds of proteins, if you will, that can go inside cells, have large surface area interactions, and function as intracellular antibodies, so to speak. They're not really antibodies, but they're intracellular equivalents to antibodies. And so that's something that we feel that's our handle now on the world of proteins that are truly undruggable in the physics sense of that word, that phrase. And we therefore can tackle targets that nobody else can.
Interesting. So what are your kind of filters, your rough filters and your fine filters in a process like that?
Yeah. So when starting a company, the company picked very wisely some classical targets that have been traditionally undruggable, like both in the physics sense of the word and in that lots of companies have tried. The holy grail, the big example of this is beta-catenin. So most every company that's around right now, top 20 companies, had a whack at making a Wnt beta-catenin pathway inhibitor. Like they've just taken a try.
Yep.
And everyone knows that based on where these mutations occur in the pathway that drive cancer, that you need to be a step downstream of those mutations. And a step downstream means the interface between beta-catenin and TCFs. Like that's the node. Everyone knows that. It's not an innovation of Parabilis, but everyone's known. But that's a flat protein interaction. It's a classic example of the kind of undruggable target that I mentioned a minute ago. And this company has such a thing. So the filter is, we can talk about that product and its promise momentarily, but that's an example of the process that we pick a target that the world kind of knows is very important in a disease, is causally directed to a condition. And our whole portfolio is those kinds of products, those kinds of targets. And so we know that there's no examples of those that are in the industry, but yet the cancer genetics and other forms of confidence are there so that it's not a piece of spaghetti being thrown at a wall, but rather there's a lot of confidence around that being very important in disease.
Sure.
And furthermore, it's very important that that disease itself, you'll say this back to me probably, but that disease itself is not just about the target, but this be reliably a best in disease target. It's something that patient would prefer over all other treatments for that disease. So that's an important filter for me. It's not just that the protein's not been drugged, but it has to yield medicine for a disease that is otherwise going to be much more poorly treated.
And I think to an unmet need, absolutely. And I think that thing about kind of connecting the dots differently is part of what you've kind of described. I mean, I think you've said that, good drug hunters, and I guess you would hopefully count yourself as one, connect the dots in a unique way. Have you got any examples from Theravance, Merck, Parabilis, where, your team's perspective has led you to a kind of breakthrough?
Yeah, that's a great question. At Theravance, the founding principle was multivalent drug design. So small molecules that had more than one binding site, sometimes on the same protein, sometimes different proteins. We would call those today bispecifics in the protein world. In the small molecule world, we would call them like protacs and riptacs and all. So, Theravance, in retrospect, saw that world of bispecifics and antibody drug conjugates, or things that had carried more than one function that had some big impact biologically and medically as a result, way before it was actually a thing in our industry. So when I came to J&J, I saw the potential for other kinds of bispecifics. The J&J team progressed 3 of those. One of them is called amivantamab today. It's a drug, but it's a EGFR c-MET bispecific, and it fit perfectly into my framing of even the founding of Theravance, like on how that would work, what the relative affinities need to be, very quantitatively what a good bispecific would look like. And that's how I think about those. And I think it's not just piecing 2 things together, but rather being very thoughtful about why those choices and the relative affinities of each. So amivantamab, then teclistamab, talquetamab, the CD3 bispecifics, we were very early in that whole CD3 redirector space. And those, all 3 of the molecules I named are drugs today and treating patients really effectively. But that's a straight dot-to-dot connection from things I used to think about every day at Theravance to what was possible with the modalities that J&J was using. Similarly, like the second chapter of Theravance, if you will, we're making medicines that were delivered in a localized manner. And we had a mantra that said, if it's a localized disease, we should give a localized medicine. So this localized medicine for localized disease concept was what I used when growing conviction around a Terrace acquisition. This is a product intended to treat bladder cancer by delivering in a pretzel-shaped slow release device something straight into your bladder that would just slowly release drug. In those earliest stages of bladder cancer, the disease is in fact localized. So it made perfect sense to me, but not all molecules can be delivered that way. Some would shoot right through, some wouldn't get to the target. So those exact same principles that I used to think about at Theravance in its second chapter came to be actionable at J&J. So these are maybe dots being connected over 10 or 15 years. But to me, it was very obvious, some of this, and enabled conviction, which is very important in our business.
I'll kind of dig into your leadership as well as your kind of ability to drug hunt. These principles must be transferable. How do you bring teams along with your way of thinking in what you're doing?
Yeah, that one's a little bit harder for me to know exactly, but I give great respect to my team. Like I bring people along, I think, by showing respect. I'm not a dictatorial leader, but I can be very decisive when I need to be and move things along. I do believe that, the teams I build, the individuals that comprise them are typically very seasoned, they're experienced, but yet their seasoning and experience has not led to them being know-it-alls or being resistant to learning. So they have to simultaneously be very curious and humble. And that humility probably is the most important feature of all. Like no matter how long, how many decades like we've been around, there's lots of new things to learn where we might need to discard our current learnings and then revisit. But it takes some confidence in teams to do that. So both I attract the right people, but I also try to make it okay to disagree and have great conversations and really show respect of people that are putting in the time and energy to think. And that's helped just solidify teams, I think, over the years.
Interesting. Well, I want to jump to maybe AI in that conversation because clearly this is a different team member than you've ever had in your career. How do you kind of see, data science? Let's start there with J&J. Clearly, you were a leader in bringing that discipline into the company. How do you see AI now, and how do you see AI going forwards?
Yeah, fascinating question. That's probably one of the biggest questions one could ask right now. So I've been thinking for more than a decade right now that, before Merck even, that you could see the writing on the walls. You could see the coming together of data sets in accessible format in hospitals, the advent of Epic and the real change in hospital systems that created. You saw that externally. You saw NHS starting to digitize everything that it had. So all over the world, kind of in parallel, were these efforts to bring data forward in a digestible manner that you could aggregate and digest. Second, you could see all the compute getting better and better. The chips were stronger, and the algorithms that in the past were not powered, the chips were too weak, but neural nets became like a thing. And convolutional neural nets were suddenly had a name. And so machine learning and AI combined with compute, combined with data, you could see it coming. You just connect those dots. And even a decade ago, you could see that offered power in our world of creating and commercializing medicines to reinvent major aspects of that. So I believe we're like a third of the way through that right now, like not even half. And at Merck, I really pushed pretty hard to recreate that. But at J&J, I had the authority to do that. And so I really like pushed really hard. And I attribute the sort of the success that we had both to the individuals that were in charge. Najat Khan in particular, I would give her great credit, having both the intelligence and the EQ to navigate that company and create, but also, that we deliberately picked to work in drug development first before drug discovery, because that allowed people to see that return on the invested energy faster. And so that was very important in terms of culture change of a big company, and then change the decision-making structure within that company so that we could centralize more and make things happen and pick the problems that mattered the most to the business and to patients, and just went backwards from there. And then eventually ended up in drug discovery. But those lead times are a lot longer to show business level impact. But all of that, I think, is going to get reinvented again and again as the years go on. So in terms of predicting the future, I do think drug development takes a certain amount of time and a certain number of patients to dose, because biology is still terribly complex, and much of those subtleties the data are not assembled yet in a digestible format. So we'll have to be a little bit more patient in some regards, but I think the chances of drawing boundaries around patients that are more likely to respond, so-called precision medicine, and where it's dangerous to treat or not dangerous to treat, like precision safety, those aspects are going to be here and now. So the probability of success, I think, should rightly go way up rather than the usual like 5-10% of a phase 1 product making it to a commercial product should be higher. And the chances, to me, of that product having major impact on the world is higher, because you should be able to more precisely point that drug to certain patients and know what your differentiation is relative to other drugs. I think the number of representatives of a certain class will not be like 10 or more in the future, but rather go down, because it's not going to be worthwhile like coming out of a phase 2 going forward. Right now, there's such randomness to that. I mean, a lot of energy resource in our industry puts products forward that will never be interesting medicines, right? So everything will get better, both from a science development and commercialization and patient impact, I think, as this continues to roll forward. All the AI, data science aspects continue to roll forward.
And it's interesting that you referenced with Epic and the NHS, because your source of unmet need in those designs, I think, is often left out of a lot of what people talk about with AI discovery. Where they've got medicines which are going forwards, hopefully, but you're describing this end-to-end design for a medicine which will be successful in 10 years' time.
It's the right way to think about it. I think right now, parts of our whole ecosystem that become siloed off, and there are companies that focus on AI and drug discovery. There's some specific aspect of binding that they're improving, but if those companies can't also think about what kind of medicines those would create and whether those medicines are going to be of value, then there may or may not be value in what they're doing. So it is still rare to think end to end, but I think it's the only way to go. And I can't imagine not doing it.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit to, I'm going to say, over the years we've been doing our innovation index, J&J has been a clear leader in that space, and that kind of, things like J Labs and a bunch of other things which were, really pioneering at the time. Your LinkedIn profile mentions your mission to build and inspire world-class teams to improve human health. What would you say is a kind of key lesson about the scale of organization and the kind of way that you can build a team towards
Yeah,
that goal?
that's a great question. I do think that our ecosystem is necessarily comprised of both large, medium, and then small companies and very small companies. And they all have different advantages and disadvantages in how they best contribute. I would say that all of them, regardless of your size of company, is an improbable endeavor. Like it's hard to have great impact no matter what kind of company you sit in. But let's start with bigger companies. I think bigger companies have an advantage where they can bring real muscle to something. And they, in some ways, they have a unique ability to take long-term risk, but ironically, often they take the least risk. And because there are needs of that organization that seep all the way down through discovery that make them a little bit more risk averse. At J&J, we didn't do that. We had Alex Gorski that I feel was incredibly ambitious on behalf of Johnson & Johnson that made him more than okay, but be willing to do what is contrarian actually at the time and actually take risk in order to create great reward for patients and for J&J. So there are many practice-changing medicines that were created that have profound impact, like Carvykti. It's not like a company has had a successful CAR T product at the time in 2017 where I licensed that product in from Legend, GenScript Legend. But we believed that leaning into risk like that could create profound value for patients, profound value for the company. And there are multiple of those, like the first to lean into the bispecifics, the first to really do precision therapy in neuropsychiatry, big impact on cardiovascular, like thrombosis is still one of the things that per WHO harms more people in the world than anything else, ischemic events to the brain and the heart. So these are areas where we could build products that were not Me Too's at all, but each of them were practice changing. I'm very proud of the portfolio we created, both in its density, like of, the amount of value, amount of good you could do per unit resource or per person or per dollar spent. And now on what's coming out the other end and has been for about 5 years and will for the next like 5 and 10 years. I think that comes when you take strategic risk with teams that can take strategic risk in an organization that can do that. And that's something that a larger company can certainly do, but very few actually end up doing. And then on a small company, I feel it's different still. Like, I described to you a few minutes ago, like the arc of change and bringing data science into a big 140,000 person organization is non-trivial. You have to think through all the human dynamics and plot them out much like you would biology. Like, what change leads to what change, what begets what. And where in a smaller company, you can skip all the way to the end and just install a change from the beginning. There's not the same degree to which you have to do change management. So almost immediately you can get going something that's very novel. You don't have, another, employee that has the same, works for the same company all the time to call, but you build external networks and you compensate for that lack of necessarily everyone being in the same house by building these external networks and solving problems in different ways. You can make decisions very quickly. You can deploy, you don't have to have 10 people necessarily say yes to act on something. So small companies have a way of contributing something that's mind-blowingly different. Yet, again, just like the criticism I made of larger companies, yet few do.
Yeah.
And find all sorts of small companies doing exactly what large companies would do, like making the next KRAS inhibitor or doing something like that, where they find themselves in a foot race with a much larger, better resource company. So why not harness the strengths of your part of the ecosystem? Ironically, all these parts have strengths, yet the occupiers of those parts often don't harness them. They, in fact, do the opposite, which is crazy.
Well, we hear this a lot, that the kind of venture-led organizations are doing what their shareholders or their investors are still telling them to do. which is often at odds with kind of what's in the medium and long-term benefit of those companies. Do you find that in the environment?
I do. It depends on the investors. Like we happen at Parabilis to have, I think, some very good investors. And, that's a whole conversation in itself. Like, how do you get the investors you have?
Yep.
And I think if you're not in a good spot, when you talk to investor X and investor X asks you to do something and they'll give you money in exchange for doing that thing, you're more apt to say yes than no. And then you start compromising your own, sense of things necessarily. Like you start going down roads and you might take it, you're being very expedient, you think you're being practical, but then 2 years later, there's the potential for divergent vision.
Yeah.
And then those companies, even if you're on a good path, sometimes don't have a good outcome.
Yeah.
So, I recommend all entrepreneurs to hold their conviction. Maybe that means you won't get funded or you get funded a lot less,
Yeah.
but if you're inoculating against that state of affairs 2 years from now, that's very complicated and where different people have different sense of what the company is and isn't.
Yeah.
So to me, as long as you get the investors you deserve at the end of the day, and so hold out for the investors that share your vision. The investment world is very heterogeneous. There are many amazing investors. And so find the ones that actually match what you want to do with your company.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to come back to kind of your description of the learning environment in, large and small organizations and, what I would describe as asymmetric learning. So the ability to, learn faster than the other guys. Maybe any examples of times when your teams have faced setbacks when, your ability to learn faster than the other guys has helped?
Well, there are plenty of times when my teams face setbacks, but I wouldn't necessarily attribute it to not learning faster than others, though. But the setback sometimes is biology just being surprising, even though you're trying to do something of value. But even that, actually, let me comment on that a little bit more. So there were times where, this is something that has changed during the course of my career. Like there was a program way back when at Theravance that we pursued that activated 5-HT4 receptors, serotonin receptors, 5-HT4. And these were very important receptors to move your gut. So sometimes your gut lacked that serotonergic drive and you became constipated or you felt pain from that kind of constipation. And we spent years, probably it was like a 3-4 years in discovery, 3-4 years in development. So we're 7 or 8 years in, and we have some beautiful data from a phase 2 study in a couple hundred patients showing like profound reductions of constipation, big elevations in living life more normally. However, it was that era of 3-4 years where high dose studies were done to rule out QT prolongation. It was a time when Propulsive was pulled off the market and it became almost an obsession with the industry to run thorough QT studies at doses that maybe were 10 times higher than your therapeutic dose. And we got caught in the swirl of that and found that we were barely positive in this 10x higher dose study, but that caused us to grind to a halt. And we just couldn't extricate ourselves from that, given that it was chronic constipation that we were treating. If people were dying of that condition, it may have been different. But, that was a horribly disappointing thing. I don't know that we were thinking any less carefully about the science and the medicine, but I committed at that point that I did want to work on, as Roger Perlmutter would put it, very grievous illnesses. Like it's a nice term for it, but very serious illness that could accommodate sometimes a medicine that's less than 100% perfect because of the profound utility it had on the condition.
Yeah.
And that's very important that we work on grievous conditions. And I changed my sort of outlook on the kinds of projects I'd prefer to do, very high impact projects on making medicines that saved extreme pain and suffering, extended life, and had profound impact, most often with a mortality endpoint. So that's something that became important to me as a result of that learning. And there were probably other times where we just weren't thinking hard enough. I'm sure there were. But you're right that this learning mindset is everything. And most people, like at some mid stage of their career, lean too heavily on their experience and stop learning per se, stop reading new material, stop being open to new things. And so all of my team, I keep encouraging, never do that. Like,
Yeah, how would you, let's go back to J&J, how would you contrast kind of large and small? It's a small biotech, but scale is different than J&J. How do
it
you,
is.
how
We
do you,
don't have, yeah,
how,
we obviously don't have the resources of a J&J,
no,
but, I think what we're doing at Parabilis, it's unlikely that any larger organization would willingly tackle. They think there's risk in taking brand new kinds of proteins, and they may think it's doubly risky then to use a new modality to do that. But I know that's not the case because A, we have confidence around these particular proteins because of all the genetics, and genetics are very powerful.
Mm.
And B, our modality, even though we sometimes call it new, it is a peptide. And peptides right now are pretty well known. There are a lot of people injecting themselves with GLP-1 agonists, those are peptides. And maybe ours is a different kind of peptide. But nevertheless, that first level analysis of novelty and novelty squared, I think keep people, large companies included, from rushing into what we do. So we don't have the resources of a J&J, but we have awfully powerful team. We have novelty on our side, and I feel we'll be years forward before others kind of recognize this to not be the high risk endeavor that they might think it is.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we're
Right.
perfect. Fine.
And it's interesting. I mean, my feelings about decision making of phase one, phase two, and large and small pharma. So you do feel that's one area for improvement when you get to a larger scale is seeing that you have scale and using it to your advantage doesn't seem to happen as often as you'd imagine.
No, that's the big irony.
Yeah.
Like what should be possible in one setting sometimes is not harnessed.
Yeah.
Big
Yeah.
companies are not as risk taking as they could afford to be. And smaller companies are not as innovative as they should be or could afford to be.
Yeah. It's interesting, but you've seen, I mean, where you are in biotech, you've seen it through, various cycles, good and bad times, I guess. And today's a, particularly bad time in the, common culture. How would what have you learned about staying resilient over 20, 30 years?
I think it is to understand that rarely, and it's not that way today, but it's never happened in my life that the sky is truly falling.
Yes.
Like that, neither is it all like roses either. So, but for those that have experienced a shorter segment of time, like that have been in the industry for 5 years, depending on which 5 years, it can seem all great or all horrible. And the truth is, it takes a long time to develop, research, find, develop, and commercialize a product, right? These are 10, 20-year cycles by the time things are selling well and in patients. So invariably during that kind of time frame, there are multiple ups and downs in the cycles. So you kind of need to figure it out if you're a company that is end to end on how to thrive in any environment. So you need to not get too flustered by a winter. You need to not get too happy by a summer, and you need to be able to navigate with different investor sentiments and different interest rates and macro environments. And so you need to preserve cash when it's there in plenty. And you need to still be able to spend as you need to when it doesn't seem like you can.
Yeah.
So these environments can be navigated. I've been doing this my whole career. It's mostly a mindset of not getting too flustered.
Yeah. I think you've also mentioned that there are, too many companies, diluting effort in the space. How do you ensure kind of Parabilis' focus on unique modalities gives you an edge in that world?
Yeah. So I do think that when there's so much capital in an environment, then you do have a tendency to create companies that are difficult to sustain in a lower capital environment. And those companies work on things maybe that seem related to other companies' same efforts. And so you get more redundancy in the system. I feel like the most limiting two things in our lives are people that actually have genuinely good ideas and the people that can genuinely execute. Like those two things are the rate limiting parts of what we do. And those numbers have not changed whether we have 100 companies in our environment or 10,000. So almost invariably, if you have 10,000 companies in the environment, many of them are working on things that are very related to other companies, and then they don't seem as differentiated. They don't get the funding in winters, but they do get the funding in summers. So to me, like it's back to basics. It's work on things that you think have great meaning to the middle investors, those that are kind of crossovers and development stage investors, and have great value to commercial organizations, have great value to patients, and that all needs to line up. If you just go back to those kinds of fundamentals and make sure you're working on such projects and are quick to kill things that prove themselves not that category project, you'll be perfectly fine, whether at a big company or small company.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to pivot to, Parabilis, and your mission and your kind of future. You've got what I would describe as kind of a bunch of tough targets in there. How do what's your big picture for, hard targets and learning against those targets? Because you mentioned, seeing forwards to a future where you make a difference to patients' lives. How do
Yeah.
you bring that back to the kind of mission?
Yeah. So it is around starting with that. They
Mhm.
want to make medicines that are durably differentiated, right? That are not just differentiated for the moment, but you can imagine at whatever we've done as being hard to do, and therefore it's durably differentiated. That's the overall mission,
Yeah.
and that those medicines should make a profound impact on grievous disease. So going back a step from that, the modality that I described before of these peptides that have non-canonical amino acids. In fact, we use like 1,500 different amino acids instead of the normal 20. And we've learned over collection of vast amounts of data being used to train some pretty spectacular models that only we have access to, that we have a moat, a so-called barrier to entry around what we do that would make it very difficult for a company just to come in and do exactly what we do, big or small. There's a learning curve to go up that's probably years long, many years long. And we plan on keeping it that way, that we're particularly good and at what we deploying our like giant two-handed sword, and not all groups will be able to do that. So one, we have barrier entry. Two, we pick targets that like beta-catenin, like ERD for prostate cancer, like SHOC2, like androgen receptor in a unique way, like the cyclins. All transcription factors are basically at our disposal. There, virtually anything you can imagine, we might be able to, we can give a good shot of drugging. So as long as we're using selection criteria that sort of triangulate and tell us that the use of genetics, the use of other kinds of evidence from the real world data sets tell us that modulating that protein is useful, we'll go forward. It is the minority of those that will yield amazing medicines. So we're just careful about how we select our projects. And we think because of the uniqueness of our approach, that others would find it difficult just to flood in. It's not a typical small molecule. It's not a typical bispecific or ADC or antibody. So they're not familiar with how to navigate and create on this kind of modality. So I think that's our secret, is select the right products that we have high conviction will make great medicines, and keep moving our platform forward so that it's always a few years ahead of what others can actually do themselves.
It's interesting you use the word moat to kind of describe this kind of, barrier to entry for, a company to approach Parabilis. Is that something that, the team feels and, works on?
Yeah, I don't think specifically because it's a moat, but because we're constantly striving to make our modality as effective as it can. So, the number of times we have to turn the crank to optimize our peptide, or the role of computation, de novo computation. We work hard to, we're trying right now to create what we might think of as a model for all our helicons, which is what we call them, I don't want to use the word foundation model because I think that too is an overused expression sometimes, but that sort of thing where we have a fundamental understanding and could do de novo design. We have through John McGee, he's one of the co-founders of our company that worked with Greg Dine. He's constantly thinking of like some pretty creative, fabulous experimental innovations and how to piece that all together. So we have individuals in our company right now that purely because of curiosity and pursuit of excellence are working on our core platform. The result is sometimes a barrier to entry because maybe that's something that others don't have, but it certainly has that business side benefit of a amazing moat.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to move on to maybe, you, Mathai, and, your personal reflections. You've seen a lot over your time. I'm guessing mostly failure with some success. How do you describe failure? How do you deal with it in your day-to-day life?
Yeah. I do think that for a lot of people, repeated failure, which is the rule in our industry, leads to conservatism.
Yeah.
Like it makes people not want to keep banging their head on a wall and leads them to pursue projects where it's more likely than not they can get to a development candidate or a positive phase 2 study. But I think for me at least, and maybe lots of other people too, that are maybe in this minority, I try really hard to keep my eye on the prize. Like I know what I value, like why I'm in this business is definitely the alleviation of suffering of patients, their families, their communities. So that then makes the failures useful as opposed to a force that moves you into incrementalism and conservatism.
Yeah.
So that's how I manage it. I always remember why I get up out of bed and why I come into work. It's for that ultimate prize of human impact. And so then it makes all the other stuff fall into place.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, you and I have had these conversations before about why I, disrespect the kind of the PTS and the calculations that are definitely wrong, but definitely also guide the kind of conservatism in the portfolio reviews. You must have seen a lot of that over your time.
Lots, because then that's what leads sometimes to it's a calculation of ENPV
Yep.
that says this project is more worthwhile than this project based on very limited information, not understanding medical practice and how it can change, overweighting what is done today.
Right.
This lack of ability to predict the future and the use of that prediction, nevertheless, in portfolio decisions is terrible.
Yep.
Like, so I would never use like A versus B on an ENPV standpoint to pick A over B, but rather, where do you think this medicine can go? Describe qualitatively the kind of impact that medicine can have, anticipate where diagnosis is moving, anticipate where other medicines might also have an impact so that those patients don't need your medicine tomorrow, but might today. So I'm not saying it's easy, but spend the time anticipating a future. And not only your future, by the way, you have to anticipate the future of other companies' efforts who also have smart, ambitious people.
Absolutely.
And so it's a very hard thing, but that's what you have to get good at, not on calculating an ENPV or a probability of technical success. Like I've never found that like a very useful exercise.
Yeah, it was one of those things people kind of circle around the drain with their ability to get better at that and to go, look, there's no good there. There's no place to get to a lot of that work. But for someone who's kind of early, when you started out, someone who is early, who wants to be an entrepreneur, what would be, your one piece of advice for that person in our industry?
Maybe a couple pieces of advice is do know what you're playing for. Like, and without judgment, it could be for a financial return, it could be for impact, it could be to do a new piece of science, it could be to see that through, open a door, but know with great clarity, don't fool yourself, like know what you're playing for. And that may change in 5 years or 10 years, but know what you're playing for today. And second, have conviction around the thing that you've chosen to do. Like don't give up too quickly on the thing because undoubtedly you will encounter misfortune you need to overcome. So that resilience It's overstated sometimes again, but that resilience is incredibly important. And so, sometimes it's said, especially I saw it at Merck and J&J, people talk about resilience of team leaders as sometimes a bad thing. Like you have too much advocacy and too much push. That can be true, I guess, but that's a minority of the time. Usually it's the opposite, that it's the lack of resiliency, it's a lack of conviction and spirit to basically get over problems and overcome. That's the actual problem. So as an entrepreneur, especially, you're going to face every single problem. Everyone's going to be a naysayer. Very few people around you are going to support you. So develop and have the emotional resiliency. Don't give up on your initial conviction and know what you're playing for. And if you those two things and you're generally thoughtful and earnest, you'll do great.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard the word spirit on this podcast quite a few times, and I do think it's fundamental to great teams. You can almost sense it when you walk in the room, whether a team's going to go somewhere or whether they're just kind of, doing what they're supposed to, but don't have that edge. I don't know how you even test for spirit in a team, but it's clearly fundamental.
Sometimes, you can tell from someone that's done something really hard in their life that's totally unrelated to our business.
Yeah.
So that spirited nature of someone that's able to have them navigate and succeed in a sport, or it doesn't have to be, can be in anything,
Yeah.
but that they've clearly had to overcome repeatedly makes them a great marketing leader, great developer, great scientist. That greatness is transferable, I feel, if that spirit of accomplishment is there, that winning spirit.
Interesting. A question I didn't maybe think about in advance, but do you have any book recommendations for folks to have one book, one go-to?
I just recently read one. This has nothing to do with, well, indirectly it does maybe, but nothing obvious to do with drug development. But the author is Joshua Waitzkin, and it's called The Art of Learning. And he's an amazing gentleman, this Joshua. He started life as he became a child prodigy in chess.
Right.
And he became the US national champion and then was one of the top in the world for years. He stopped playing entirely at 21. By the way, he was the subject of a movie and a book called In Search for Bobby Fischer.
Okay.
And so he was a very famous individual after that was written up. But then at 21 years old, he switched his entire focus away from chess to Tai Chi and became, again, through deliberate learning, the US national champion and then the world champion in Tai Chi.
Amazing.
Super unusual for someone to be like 5, 6 Sigma out on a physical discipline and an intellectual discipline and be so successful like that. And he describes how he thinks of both Tai Chi and chess as almost the same thing,
Right.
which is crazy. But he thinks about how he learns and his, I'm going to not do justice to it, but his like the one liner is 100% master level 1 before moving to level 2, 100% master level 2 before moving to level 3. And just the art of doing that and the discipline it takes to do that in order to know the fundamentals before you start to apply them in complex ways is his secret. I don't know if that's perfectly transferable to what we do, but I really enjoyed the book.
I thought, well, it sounds perfect for the asymmetric learning kind of concept.
Actually, who recommended it to me was Hal Barron. And so he described it to me and I read it immediately.
Fantastic. Just to close, I mean, Parabilis is going somewhere. Where do you see it in 5, 10 years' time?
Where do I want it to go? I want us to be a multiple therapeutics company. There are very few platform companies that produce any drugs, and sometimes they produce one drug. I want us to produce multiple amazing medicines that are unique and grow as a result and show that we can innovate along the way, whether by using data science or AI methodologies or new experimental innovation in the R&D phase. And then, conversations you and I have had in the past about the future of commercialization, how that might work if we were fortunate enough to get there, to innovate there too in wise and good ways. Yeah. So I'd like to show the world what an amazing company can look like and produce medicines that are of high value.
Amazing. Well, I'm there with you, so it's going to be a fun ride together. So, Mathai, I mean, every time I speak to you, it's rich and it's joyful. So, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate the time chatting.
That's it for this week's episode of Idea Collider. To continue the conversation, visit our website at ideapharma.com. Follow us in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcast. Until next time, I'm Mike Rea, wishing you great success.